In this video, I would like to demonstrate that the book of Exodus is based on the monomyth. I believe I've finally learned enough now to where I can see that and where I can effectively demonstrate it in a video. I'm not going to go through the entire thing. It's just too long. We'd be here for a long time. What I'm going to do is kind of just overview a few things. What is the monomyth? What are the steps? What are they for? How does it look in stories from antiquity, mythologies, and religions? If they're all built on the same monomyth, how do we see it? My name is Dan Paulson, and welcome to the channel. Okay, first of all, the monomyth, we have all seen it, I'm sure. We may not know that we've seen it, or we may not be aware of it, but it is very common in storytelling culture. In fact, these are very downstream and somewhat modified versions, but as we're watching movies of Greek mythology and things like that, or even today, currently getting into the more modern movies with, with all the superheroes. There's incredible modifications, but all of those have their origins in Greek mythology. These were original people that were part of their myths, and we're seeing them all the time. Star Wars is written on the monomyth template as well. We'll take a quick look at that. So we have seen these. We may not know that we're seeing them, but they're right there in our face all the time. It was about 75 years ago when Joseph Campbell first published this book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And I'll just briefly overview what this is. And I'm not recommending you get this. It's a little bit different. I'm going to go through, there's some steps that he identified in this as he open-mindedly went through mythology and religions from antiquity, just reading it, studying it, not just reading it one time like we might do, but really getting into it and trying to grasp what they're doing and trying to live in their culture. He began to realize that there's some common steps in myths and religions that were not easy to see to begin with, because they're held in verbiage that are different. It's cryptic. So there's something in the background that's happening that he began to realize was so common between the stories that he developed the steps there, and that is what became the monomyth. There's always a calling. There's somebody that is singled out, a male that is brought out that's going to be the hero. This person is called but doesn't want to go. There's a denial of the call. We'll go through a couple of things in the book actually to do that. But these were the sequences that he saw happening in the story that, somebody was told you must go and they were like, no, I can't. Then they had to for some reason. Then they went through some sort of a stage of supernatural preparation. Then they had to cross a river or a canyon or some kind of a threshold, crashing rocks, Red Sea. All of these, it was like, well, there's something. These steps are happening. They're not all the same thing. Going through rocks is not the same thing as going through the sea, which is not the same thing as getting ferried across a river. Those are all different until you realize they're conceptually holding the idea that you crossed something. That is what is nested there, and that is what he began to see. And that is where his listing from the monomyth came from. We have to modify it. We're not going to use it exactly like he did. There's more to it. There's more to it. Okay, let's start with a brief overview of what the monomyth is. The 17 stages of Joseph Campbell's monomyth. And I just downloaded this from the internet to make it easier on myself. I'm not going to go through it all. We're going to go through and look at it, though. It shows the structure, that there's kind of 3 sections in there. The separation up on the upper left. That whole lower half is the initiation, and then the upper right section, we've got a return. And that within each one of those larger sections, there's individual steps that we take along the way. And these are the sequences that he was picking out. The call to adventure. Somebody's always singled out of the crowd. Somehow they're held out as somehow different. That they don't want to go, that they don't feel themselves worthy. But then they do go and they move on to supernatural aid. And then there's some sort of a threshold to go over, the belly of the whale. You see, he left the terms very nebulous. You look at them as it moves on. Meeting with the goddess. What is that? But there are things that he's seeing happen inside of these stories as you go in. It's like, oh, now the next step is meeting with some sort of a female along the way. It's not always a goddess, but at any rate, okay, what I'm going to do in this video, to keep it short, is just do about the first 4 or 5 there. The call to adventure down to, say, the belly of the whale. I'm just going to take those first steps and let's identify those in a few places. Before we do, I want to say that we're not using words literally here. If you can imagine Aesop's fable and going through that story and knowing that there's a nested meaning in there, and you're trying to extract that by trying to figure out how the story works, that is what we're going to be doing here. To read Exodus as if it's real is like reading a fable as if it's real. Seriously, it goes into a different realm with a different kind of packaging, but it has to be interpreted. Everything that we're going to work with is going to have to be interpreted. It's going to be meaningful to something else. And literally what I'm looking for is what that template is. So I'm going to go through a lot of stories to try to make comparisons, line them up side by side, mythology and religions back and forth, and line up these weird component parts. Some of them match very well. Some of them don't sound close at all. But it's just new verbal tricks we're going to get into. Okay, first let me just create a list here of the 5 steps of Joseph Campbell's that I'm going to use right here. And then we're going to go find these in Exodus. Let's go see if we can find those. And again, given the sheer size of it, actually, there's some expectation that you already know what's going on and have an idea or have a Bible and things like that. It would just take too long for me to read through it, and I need to try to compress these videos. Okay, so let's just go look at a couple of things. Number 1, let's go find the calling. I'll set the scene. This is there's been a few things that have happened, but Moses right here appears on Mount Horeb. He's taking care of the sheep. He's out taking care of the animals, and he finds the burning bush, and he's afraid. He's like, oh my gosh, I got to turn away. And God is talking to him at this point. So this is where there's going to be a denial. There's going to be a calling. There's going to be a denial, and there's going to be supernatural aid, all 3 showing up right here. Let's go ahead and look at the calling and see what that looks like. All right, so here we have the Lord has just told Moses, I see the pain of my people down there, and he addresses him here. Now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And the Lord told him, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Okay, that's a very solid calling. You, very specifically, it is you. Me, God, you. Any question? Nobody else. Me, Moses, you. There's a calling. Okay, what do we have next is the denial of the call. The denial and the supernatural aid, they can be different sequences. Here he later on says, but Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant. But I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, Who gives speech to mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to speak. But he said, O my Lord, please send someone else. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, What of your brother Aaron the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Even now he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, his heart will be glad. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. He indeed shall speak for you to the people. He shall serve as a mouth for you, and you shall serve as God for him. Take in your hand this staff with which you shall perform the signs. Okay, let's talk about a couple things right here. What we just had happen was a number of things. God said, I'm leading you. And then later on, Moses is telling him, I can't even speak right. No, I'm not the one. There's something else going on here. There's something else being created in this story, but there is the denial. You had the calling. You need to go. The denial. I can't do it. All right. Supernatural aid. We jumped over that, but again, there are sequences in here that must be maintained through this template, but some of them don't need to. The calling, that has to happen first. The denial of the call and the supernatural aid, those can be inverted. There's no sequence necessarily there that has to be maintained. They're before the crossing of the threshold, which is when the adventure begins. So this is just kind of a setup. The calling, of course, has to happen. You can't deny the call before the call comes. You can see some of this has to play out sequentially, and some of it not so. Okay, supernatural aid, what did we actually have up here? If we go back and look at it. Then Moses answered, but look, They may not believe me or listen to me, but say the Lord did not appear to you. The Lord said to him, What is that in your hand? He said, A staff. And he said, Throw it on the ground. So he threw the staff on the ground, and it became a snake, and Moses drew back from it. Then the Lord said to Moses, Reach out your hand and seize it by the tail. So he reached out his hand and grasped it, and it became a staff in his hand, so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Okay, there's the one. But there is, what that is, okay, they just got supernatural aid. And as you go through, and I'm going to, again, skip through a lot of this stuff, that staff is going to come in handy as far as touching things, creating stuff, turning the Nile to blood and all that sort of stuff. This is going to become a magical thing like, what would Greek myth have? Thor's hammer or something like that. There's going to be supernatural aid involved in there. Some kind of a God helping you along the way. Okay, so there's the supernatural. So we have the calling, the supernatural aid, and the denial. Those three happening right there. We got a crossing of the threshold next. What happens? They eventually leave Pharaoh. Pharaoh finally lets them go, and look at what happens as we get down to that part. So after the plagues and after Pharaoh finally allowed them to go, they get to here, and the Egyptians, the Egyptian army has chased the Israelites and pinned them up against the sea, and it looks like it's about the end of. It looks like it's the end for them. But then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on the right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down on the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into a panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Okay, we'll just stop right there. Did you see the crossing of the threshold conceptually? So we had a calling, a denial, a call. Supernatural aid is there, crossing of the threshold. Belly of the whale, what is that? We are now into a new place. We've left that behind. We are in a devoid place, a big empty void right here. They are in the wilderness. I'll stop right there. Those are the 5 steps that we can see emerging in a common template. That is a common template. Okay, having said that, I need to freelance a little bit. I have worked on this so much that I've identified 2 steps in that front section right there that are not included in Joseph Campbell's template, and I want to talk about them. One of them is it's there often. It doesn't have to be there. The other one is there in every story. It has to be there. There's 2 steps. First one is, at first, before a calling, there is a special isolation. Even way before the person is called, they are selected out. And what do we have with Moses? Let's go see what happened before he was called. All right, we know the story, right? First, male was to be killed all around, but Moses' mother hid him in a basket, put him in the Nile, and the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. While her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. So what we have, without going into the whole story here again, is... So Moses was isolated out, he was isolated out of everything before he was even picked by God. There was something early on at birth that separated him out. So that's a step I put in there. And again, that is not one that is always there. You're also going to find that the denial, that is not always there. Sometimes people get called and they just say, okay, I'm going. Not everybody denies, but everybody, if you're called and there is an adventure, you must go on the adventure. And an example of how it might work where the denial might be there, where you can see it in place on the template, but it doesn't look like a denial, yet the component is still there, is Star Wars, the very first movie. When Luke gets the videos from Leia of the droids, all that, he wants to go. The calling was there, but he didn't deny that. But what happened is his uncle told him, no, you can't go. We've got harvest, they're shorthanded, all of that. So he couldn't go anyway. So he wanted to go, he couldn't go. The denial was put in a way that it wasn't him denying it. And there could be in other cases where the denial doesn't even happen, somebody's told you must go and they just go, okay, and they go. The denial may or may not be a component part, but the journey is. So you can see that there's a couple of steps that are optional that might be in the story and they may not be. It depends on how you want your hero to look. Okay, now there's one more step, and this is actually an incredibly important one. I'm surprised this one was missed, actually. It's very evident. It's the reason we go on the journey. This one is cyclical pain. This one is cyclical pain. Now, the way that it's held in this story is that there's 10 times that there's plagues happening. I'm not going to read it all. It's just in there. And what sequence is it? Let's look at where it is. It is right here. And the last thing that we ran into before that repeated cycles of pain was the refusal of the call and the supernatural aid, and it was before the crossing of the first threshold. So that step is going to go between 4 and 5. What I've got now is 4 and 5, and it'll adjust to look like this. We've got that repeating hurt cycle in there now before we cross the first threshold. Now, there's one more that I want to put in there that I think it's important. I don't know if it's another one of those that doesn't appear everywhere. Pharaoh says go, and then after they're gone, comes after them. There's this difficulty in leaving the past that is somehow wound up in this. That not only is there cyclical pain, but it's tough to leave that pain behind. There's a difficulty in leaving. We can't just leave Pharaoh. It's like, why is this so difficult? So there's a difficulty in leaving that is nested in this as well. And I want to say, by comparison, you can find this in other myths. I continue to use the Jason and the Argonauts one because you can just go look at the black and white movie one that contains enough parts in it. It is not accurate at all, but it has enough parts in it that you can see what is actually there. And what we have here in that particular one from the like mid-60s or early 60s or something like that. They're leaving the island of the old gods. This is early on. This is when, like Moses is trying to leave Pharaoh in Egypt, they are leaving the past behind by leaving the old gods. Hercules tries to bring something with him, and the old god comes after them and gets them. What happens in this story is that Pharaoh lets them go, but after they're gone, Pharaoh comes after them. So there's this component that you look at and go, yeah, that shows up in a few places where you are underway, but whatever this is, whatever you're supposed to leave in the past comes after you. And again, sequentially, if we look where it appears, that Pharaoh chasing you is just before the Red Sea, before the crossing of the barrier. And in the Jason and the Argonauts one, it's just before sailing through the clashing rock. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in as a step anyway and call it optional. We can go on the journey without knowing that. Yeah, it's tough to leave the past, isn't it? But sometimes it is in the stories. You do see that element in there. All right. I wanted to keep this video short and do my best within 20 minutes to try and show enough of the template and enough of what's going on to maybe get people looking at it a little bit differently. We're all looking at the same thing. It's just looking at it a little bit differently. Understanding that there is material out there that I learned to interpret a certain way, and that interpretation process was something that became consistent regardless of what I was reading from antiquity. They've got a verbal puzzle game going on that it's fixed. We can unlock it. And that's what's happening here. And that's what Exodus is. Exodus is a monomyth held in a genre of storytelling called religion that is not just an adventure to make you feel good, but actually is something that if you don't understand the template or what's going on, but you're thinking that this is some sort of factual history or something like that, this identifies who and what you are as part of your belief system, your faith, all of that sort of stuff. It's a growing society that needs guidance. I see all of that in place and a necessity for the story at that time to be that way. But it's very clearly a monomyth. It's actually a sequence of monomyths as it goes on through the book of Exodus. It's once you see the structure, it's simple to see. And then once we translate how they're using the analogous verbiage in their time and how we need to translate it to understand based on our modern biases, it's all a mental process. If you made it this far, I'll just tell you that template is based on from the time a human is born throughout their entire life. with the option of interrupting your life and looking at yourself and saying, oh my gosh, what has happened to me? How do I change my life? That's where the monomyth picks up. Creation, all of the creation myth is the individual getting to that point. There's one template. It's not just this. There are steps before getting to that singled out, but that singled out is a necessary component. We'll see that everywhere. Many are called, few are chosen. Many stand outside the narrow gate. Many carry the ark, few see inside. All of those are going to be letting us know that not many people are going to do this. There's some sort of when you're that young, what would that be? A brain type. This is some sort of a scientific evolutionary process nested in spiritual teachings. That's what I see. It's kind of scary to find that. Anyway, all right. I just want to say that in this video. Hope it was fun and interesting. Ask any questions. Make any comments. If something doesn't make sense, I'm sure in trying to go through something like this, I said something that was like, what? Can you clarify that? Yeah, I'd be happy to. Please feel free to go ahead and put any questions or comments below. All right. Hope it was fun. I'm going to continue working on Exodus. There's some things in here. There's steps along the way in the material that are much denser. These are big stories. The template, those are just the big pieces. What is contained in finer details is very rich, incredibly rich. There's an incredible palette of cryptic mystery in all of religions. All right. There's one template that they all share. That's what we're after. Love one another. See you in the next video.